The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath a pale, awakening sky. At this hour, before the light fully conquered the horizon, the sea resembled polished steel, silent, immense, indifferent. From east to west, the world still slept, yet beneath these same clouds, two armadas crept toward one another, blind and listening. No one on the waves could see the other, but both could feel it, that invisible pull between predators. On the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood motionless on the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the horizon. The dawn light reflected in his pupils like twin blades. Behind him, the ship breathed with metallic rhythm, hissing valves, murmuring engines, the distant thump of aircraft elevators. Every sound reminded him of power, precision, order. Yet beneath all of it lay a whisper he could not silence, a premonition, faint but persistent, of overconfidence's cost. He had led the Imperial Navy to glory at Pearl Harbor 6 months ago. The rising sun had spread across the Pacific like fire across oil. Hong Kong fallen, the Philippines crumbling, Singapore humbled. Now, Midway was to be the decisive blow, the victory that would break America's spine and secure the empire's perimeter for generations. The plan was elegant, clinical. Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand, lay like a sentinel halfway between Asia and the American mainland. Its capture would drag the remnants of the US Pacific Fleet into open battle. Then Japan's 4 mighty carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would finish what Pearl Harbor began. To Nagumo, it was destiny repeating itself. Yet destiny, like the sea, often conceals its storms beneath a perfect surface. Far beyond the horizon, hidden by the curvature of the earth, another fleet moved silently. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the wounded but resolute Yorktown. They did not stumble into battle. They waited for it. In the war room aboard Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance bent over the chart table. The glow of red lamps traced the arcs of aircraft patrols and wind directions. His face, lean and calm, revealed nothing. But inside, his thoughts moved with mechanical precision. Intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor had cracked Japan's naval codes. AF, the enemy's target, had been confirmed as Midway. It was no guess. It was mathematics and deduction. Spruance trusted logic more than luck, but he also understood the paradox of command. You can calculate everything except the human heart. Aboard the Yorktown, sailors patched bomb holes from the Coral Sea battle. They joked quietly as they worked, jokes to hide fear. They knew the enemy they faced was the same that had crushed fleets from Singapore to Java, and that only days ago the Japanese still seemed invincible. Above them all, the Pacific wind carried a strange calm, the kind that comes before storms that rewrite history. At 4:30 a.m., the first glimmer of light spread across the water. Somewhere out there, invisible beyond the horizon, destiny turned its face toward Midway, a lonely atoll about to become the fulcrum of the world's war. The omniscient voice would later recall, 2 fleets set sail that morning, one believing in its invincibility, the other in its chance. By nightfall, both would know the meaning of fate. Dawn thickened into gold over the Pacific. Clouds drifted low and pale, and from beneath them rose the murmuring heartbeat of hundreds of engines warming for flight. On the Akagi, flight crews moved with choreographed urgency. Red flags fluttered, fueling lines hissed, steel elevators lifted bombers to the deck. The Japanese carriers were living organisms now, vast mechanical lungs inhaling the air of war. Admiral Nagumo watched in silence as the first waves of aircraft prepared for takeoff. They would strike Midway Atoll at first light, smashing airfields and hangars before the Americans could respond. It was the same rhythm that had shattered Pearl Harbor, a symphony of order, precision, and faith in victory. But even as he watched the glinting bomb racks and polished wings, Nagumo felt the faint ache of unease. The ocean hides many things, he thought. At 4:45 a.m., the first Japanese bombers roared down the deck and into the sky, followed by their Zero escorts. The air shook as the wave lifted off, 108 aircraft slicing into the growing light, heading southeast toward Midway. They disappeared into a blazing horizon, leaving only the echo of propellers fading into the wind. On Midway Atoll, life had already begun to stir long before dawn. Radar stations hummed with static. Operators leaned over green-lit screens, sweat running down their faces despite the cool sea breeze. The Pacific had been calm for weeks. Now every flicker on the screen made hearts tighten. At 5:30 a.m., a blip appeared. Then another, then another. Multiple bogies, bearing 320, distance 150 miles. The alarm siren screamed across the island, its shrill voice shattering the morning stillness. Pilots sprinted toward their aircraft. Wildcats, buffaloes, dauntless dive bombers. Mechanics yanked off fuel lines and waved their arms frantically as engines sputtered to life. The airfield, moments ago silent, now erupted in thunder and dust. Lieutenant Jim Gray, barely 22, pulled his goggles down as the wind rushed across the runway. "Let's give them hell," he muttered, not to anyone in particular, perhaps to the ghosts of Pearl Harbor still whispering across the Pacific. His Wildcat jerked forward, wheels bouncing over coral and sand before lifting into the open blue. From the control tower, a young signal officer watched the fighters climb toward the rising sun. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer unreality of it, that an island barely 6 square kilometers wide was now the center of the world. High above the sea, the Japanese formation advanced like a swarm of silver insects. The pilots, disciplined and silent, flew in perfect formation. Below them, the ocean gleamed like a mirror. Some glanced down and thought they could see their own reflections distorted by the waves, as if the sea itself were watching them. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had once led the strike on Pearl Harbor, was not flying today. He lay below decks, injured from earlier combat, but his spirit haunted the mission, the legacy of his triumph now guiding others. When the first bombs fell on Midway, the sky exploded in sound and fire. Runways split apart. Sand and coral erupted into clouds of dust. Buildings crumpled. Anti-aircraft guns blazed back in defiance, sending orange traces through the haze. Inside a command bunker, Colonel Harold Shannon barked orders over the din. "Keep firing! They're over the north shore!" He could feel the island tremble beneath his boots. But the attack, though fierce, was incomplete. The Japanese underestimated Midway's resilience. The Americans still had aircraft, and more importantly, they had eyes on the horizon. By 6:30 a.m., as the last Japanese bombers turned back toward their carriers, a single American scout plane caught sight of something vast, glinting on the water. 4 dark shapes moving in disciplined formation, trailing wakes like scars across the ocean. The radio crackled to life. "Enemy carriers sighted! Repeat, enemy carriers sighted!" Far away, aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Spruance lifted his head from his map. For a brief instant, the red glow of the chart room seemed to flicker brighter. He said quietly to no one in particular, "So we found each other." The fuse of war had been lit. At 0700 hours, the Pacific was already ablaze with sunlight. From far above, the ocean appeared as a boundless mosaic of blue, calm, deceiving, utterly indifferent. Beneath that calm, decisions were being made that would alter the fate of nations. On the Japanese flagship, Akagi, the air was thick with tension. The first strike on Midway had returned with heavy damage reports. Runways cratered, fuel tanks aflame, but enemy aircraft still active. Commander Tamon Yamaguchi, standing beside Nagumo, urged an immediate second attack. Nagumo hesitated. To his mind, the Americans had not yet revealed their carriers. It would be reckless to expend his entire striking force on the island while enemy ships remained unlocated. Thus began the fatal arithmetic of war, waiting for clarity that would never come. A message arrived from the scout planes, cryptic, delayed, distorted by static. Enemy ships sighted. But what kind? How many? Where exactly? Nagumo's brows tightened. He gave the order that would hang over history. Rearm the aircraft. Switch out bombs for torpedoes. Prepare for naval engagement. Down below, hundreds of mechanics swarmed across the hangar decks, sweating in the heat, swapping payloads, refueling lines wide open. Gasoline pooled across the floor, shimmering in the dim light like molten glass. The carriers, proud and invulnerable, had opened their veins. From above, a single spark could have set the entire fleet ablaze. While Nagumo wrestled with uncertainty, 1,500 miles away at Pearl Harbor, men who had never seen battle held the decisive edge, the cryptanalysts of Station Hypo. In a cramped, windowless room filled with cables and coffee cups, Commander Joseph Rochefort had spent weeks breaking the Japanese naval code JN-25. It was Rochefort who had suspected that AF, a term repeated in intercepted transmissions, referred to Midway. To confirm it, he had orchestrated a deception. Midway was to send an uncoded radio message claiming that its water distillation plant had broken down. Within 24 hours, Japanese intelligence reported that AF was short on water. That single phrase had told America exactly where Japan would strike and when. Now, aboard the Enterprise and Yorktown, Spruance and Fletcher used that invisible knowledge like a blade in the dark. They had positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, hidden by clouds, beyond the reach of Japanese reconnaissance. The American pilots had slept fitfully through the night, unaware that a handful of mathematicians in Hawaii had already placed them in the jaws of destiny. At 0800, Spruance received the first reports of the Japanese attack on Midway. He nodded once. The trap was working. "Launch all aircraft," he ordered calmly. Engines coughed to life. Deck crews rushed to line up the squadrons. The Pacific wind carried the acrid scent of exhaust and salt. Spruance stepped onto the bridge wing, his cap shadowing his eyes. He did not pray. He calculated. He knew the odds were brutal. Hundreds of miles to locate the enemy. Limited fuel, untested coordination. But he also knew something else. Nagumo was blind, chasing ghosts across the sea. The omniscient voice hovered over that moment. Wars are not won by courage alone. They are won by the side that sees through the fog a second earlier than the other. Back on Akagi, an aide handed Nagumo a revised report. The sighting earlier had been misread. The enemy ships might have been only a few cruisers. Relief flickered across his face. He rescinded the rearmament order, directing that bombs be loaded again for another strike on Midway. The hangars groaned under the weight of change once more. Torpedoes returned to racks, bombs reattached, hoses uncoiled. The dance of confusion continued. Each minute that passed layered danger upon danger, like powder accumulating before a spark. And high above, the American squadrons were already on their way, blind, uncoordinated, but flying straight toward destiny. In the war's great ledger, Midway would later be remembered as a triumph of intelligence. But intelligence alone does not kill. It only points the finger. The execution still belongs to those who climb into the sky against wind and flame. The fog of war had thickened, but in its mist, shapes were beginning to form. Black silhouettes of carriers, faint glints of wings, and the first distant thunder of engines converging. The Pacific had begun to stir. Far below the sun, the horizon blurred into mist, and over that mist, the wings of hundreds of aircraft glinted like fish scales in a shifting current. The sea, usually so indifferent, now trembled with the rhythm of engines, the pulse of war gathering speed. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood at the edge of the bridge, hands behind his back, the wind pressing against his coat. The light made his face look carved from stone, hard, still, almost timeless. Beneath that calm surface, however, a slow unease coiled in his chest. He had spent his life serving the order of the old Navy, battleships, formation, honor, and patience. Yet now the world had changed around him. Battles were no longer decided by iron and range, but by shadows moving unseen above the clouds. He watched his deck crews below. Perfect discipline, the hum of efficiency, the confidence of victory rehearsed 100 times. It should have reassured him. Instead, it frightened him. He could sense the fragility beneath that perfection, the way a single mistake, a single spark, could undo an empire. The wind carried the smell of fuel and salt. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the enemy waited, invisible, patient, and perhaps already watching. He wondered, not for the first time, if the gods of the sea had abandoned them, or merely gone silent. At the same hour, aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood before a very different kind of silence. The bridge hummed with restrained energy, radio chatter, footsteps, the muted clang of machinery. Yet the man at the centre of it all spoke little. His calm was not the calm of pride, but of control. The silence of a man who calculated more than he felt. He had replaced Halsey, unexpectedly, without fanfare. Some doubted him, whispered that he lacked the instinct for command. But Spruance did not believe in instinct. He believed in structure. He believed in numbers. He believed that discipline was not the absence of emotion, but its containment. He leaned over the chart table, tracing the flight paths of the dauntless squadrons now heading toward the enemy. Each red line drawn across the map was a line drawn across someone's life. He paused, knowing that many of those young men would not return. Then, very quietly, he said to the officer beside him, "Let's see what the Pacific decides today." His tone was steady, but in that steadiness there was an understanding as old as the sea itself, that war was not a contest of strength, but of timing, of who could see a second deeper into chaos before it swallowed them both. High above the waves, one of those red lines had a name: Lieutenant Dick Best. In his cockpit, the world was nothing but heat, vibration, and noise. The Dauntless shuddered in the thin air. The smell of oil and sweat filled his lungs. Below, the Pacific shimmered like a mirror with no horizon. Every minute spent searching burned precious fuel. He checked his instruments, altitude, compass, bearings, then looked out at the endless sky. His gunner sat behind him, silent, scanning the rear arc for fighters. They hadn't seen a single ship yet, and uncertainty was beginning to bite. Best thought of home, of his wife's smile, of the child he had barely held. He did not pray for survival. He prayed only for steadiness, for one clear moment of sight when it mattered. Courage, he realized, was not the absence of fear. It was carrying fear like a weight you refused to drop. He pressed his hand against the throttle, feeling the vibration through the metal, and radioed to his squadron. "No contacts yet. Keep formation. Watch your altitudes." His voice was calm, even. A thin line of order stretched across the vastness of the sky. And somewhere far away, in that same sky, another man flew beneath the rising sun. Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi of the Hiryu checked his instruments and already knew the truth. His plane's fuel tanks were leaking, his return impossible. He had been fighting since the war began, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean. Now, worn thin by fate, he faced the one flight he had always expected. He bowed to his crew before takeoff. A simple gesture, wordless, ancient. They bowed back, and in that silent exchange lay all the emotion that orders could never express. When his aircraft left the deck, its shadow skimmed over the water like a fleeting thought. The morning light caught the emblem of the rising sun on his wings, and for an instant it looked as though the sun itself were burning. He did not fear death, he feared dishonor. He whispered to himself, perhaps to the wind, perhaps to no one. A warrior does not choose where he dies, only how. The engines roared, the sea below blurred, and he vanished into the horizon, chasing a duty that had already consumed him. 4 men, separated by miles of ocean, bound by the same silence. Nagumo, clinging to the discipline of the old world. Spruance, navigating the logic of the new. Best, the young hand reaching toward destiny. Tomonaga, the last falcon of an empire fading into flame. The sea watched them all, cold and impersonal. It did not favour one side over the other. It only waited to see who would understand it better before the end. And somewhere within that vast stillness, between sky and wave, history inhaled, waiting to exhale fire. The morning deepened into brilliance. By 9 o'clock, the sun was a white blade over the Pacific, slicing the clouds into fragments. The sea glittered, serene, beautiful, treacherous. And somewhere in that endless light, two armadas searched for each other like blind giants swinging swords in fog. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's bridge had grown tense with indecision. The attack on Midway was done, but the enemy fleet was still unseen. His scouts had failed to return. The horizon looked empty, deceptively calm. Yet beneath that calm, time was tightening around him like a noose. At 09:17, a signalman shouted from the radio room. A new sighting report, delayed, garbled, half unreadable, but in it, one phrase burned like a flare. 10 enemy ships including carriers. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Nagumo turned sharply. The mask of control cracked just enough to show the man beneath. He had been wrong. The Americans were already here. "Rearm for anti-ship strike," he barked. But it was already too late. Below decks, chaos reignited. Mechanics scrambled to swap bombs for torpedoes again. The hangars were alive with motion. Hoses, cranes, ammunition carts. Gasoline puddled on the floor. Bombs lay scattered, fuses exposed. The smell of oil and sweat thickened the air until it was almost suffocating. Outside, the sea wind had gone still. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu lay at the center of the formation, proud and unsuspecting, the heart of the Imperial Navy. To the south, their last carrier, the Hiryu, moved like a wolf on the fringe. Over the horizon, at 15,000 feet, the first American aircraft arrived. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. They had been flying for hours, fuel nearly gone. They had not found Spruance's other squadrons. They were alone. But they pressed on. Below the clouds, the Japanese fleet suddenly appeared. 4 grey islands, surrounded by destroyers and waves of sunlight. Waldron keyed his radio. "There they are, boys! Attack!" They dove low, almost skimming the water, straight into the inferno. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol reacted instantly. Dozens of Zero fighters screamed down from above, turning the air into a whirlwind of traces and vapor trails. The torpedo bombers came on slowly, brave but doomed, flying straight through it. One by one, they caught fire, wings folding, engines exploding, black smoke trailing across the water. Out of 15 planes, not a single one would survive. From the Akagi's deck, sailors cheered as flaming wrecks hit the sea. To them, it looked like victory. To the omniscient eye, it was something else, a diversion perfectly timed by fate. For in their sacrifice, the Zeros were drawn low, leaving the sky above unguarded. At 10:22, the heavens opened. From 20,000 feet, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown broke through a gap in the clouds. 3 squadrons, silent as falling stars. Among them flew Lieutenant Dick Best, his Dauntless trembling in the rush of air. The moment he saw the Japanese carriers below, his breath caught. There they were, 3 giants lined in sunlight, decks crowded with aircraft, fuel trucks, open bombs. The wind screamed against his canopy. His heartbeat matched it. He flipped his plane into a dive. Gravity seized him. The altimeter spun. 18,000. 15,000. 10,000 feet. The ocean rushing upward, the sky melting into a blur of blue and white. He shouted through the intercom, "Target middle carrier, Akagi, bombs away!" The bomb dropped, tumbling end over end, vanishing into the light. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then, the heart of the Akagi erupted. A column of fire burst through the flight deck, tearing it apart like paper. Planes, fuel lines, and men vanished into the explosion. The blast rose hundreds of feet high, a red and black tower visible for miles. From above, Best saw the fire bloom, bright, terrible, magnificent. He pulled up sharply, his plane trembling, and looked down to see two more carriers, Kaga and Soryu, struck in the same instant by other squadrons. The ocean below turned into a storm of flame. The Kaga's fuel lines ignited. Explosions walked down her deck in a chain, swallowing aircraft one by one. The Soryu's hangar detonated from within, lifting her hull out of the water before she began to list, burning from bow to stern. The sky itself seems to darken under the smoke. On the Enterprise, Admiral Spruance watched through binoculars. For a moment, the horizon shimmered, 3 rising pillars of black fire against the blue. He said nothing. He simply exhaled. Around him, officers began to cheer. But Spruance's eyes stayed fixed on the burning silhouettes. He knew what they meant, not triumph, not revenge, but the turning of history's tide. He whispered, more to himself than anyone, "The Pacific is ours again, for now." On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo clung to the rail as the deck burned beneath his feet. The carrier that had once led Pearl Harbor was now a furnace. Flames roared through every corridor. Sailors screamed and fell into the sea. He refused to leave until ordered to abandon ship. His uniform was blackened, his hair singed, yet his eyes remained calm, resigned. He watched the inferno rise around him and said softly, "So this is what the gods required." When he finally stepped onto the escorting destroyer, he looked back only once, at the ship that had been his pride, his sword, his symbol of Japan's power. Now it burned like a sun, dying on the horizon. 3 of Japan's carriers were gone. Only Hiryu remained, alone in a sea that smelled of oil and ghosts. By noon, the ocean was choked with smoke and drifting wreckage. Survivors clung to debris as the heat shimmered over the waves. The noise of battle faded, replaced by the low groan of fire devouring steel. In those few hours, the Pacific had swallowed an empire's dream, and yet the day was not done. Somewhere to the north, the Hiryu turned into the wind, her decks still clear, her pilots still ready to strike. The last counterattack of Japan was about to begin. The sea exhaled once more, calm, vast, indifferent, as if waiting to see whether mankind would ever learn from its own reflection in the water. Noon descended on the Pacific like a trembling heartbeat. Smoke drifted for miles across the water, dark banners of ruin stretching toward the horizon. Where 3 great ships had once moved with purpose, there was now only the slow hiss of burning oil and the soft crackle of collapsing steel. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were dying suns, their light dimming into the waves. But far to the north, one survivor still breathed, the carrier Hiryu, the last beating heart of Japan's proud armada. Her flight deck shone almost untouched beneath the haze. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, stood at the bridge with the composure of a man already aware of the ending. He had watched the columns of fire in the south and understood what they meant. The Empire's spear had been broken. Yet he would not yield. "Prepare the next wave," he ordered calmly. "We strike at once." Within minutes, the Hiryu's hangars roared to life. Mechanics rolled out the last remaining bombers, their metal skins glinting with the reflection of distant fire. Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi limped toward his aircraft, his body exhausted, his heart steady. The fuel leak still hissed beneath his seat, but he said nothing. He bowed to his ground crew and smiled faintly. One man whispered, "You will not return." Tomonaga answered, "Then I will not have to." The engines screamed as the planes leapt from the deck. 17 bombers and 6 fighters, all that remained of Japan's striking power. They turned east toward the faint shadow on the horizon, the American carriers. On the Yorktown, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher watched the radar screen's pulse. "Enemy inbound," the operator said quietly. "Sound general quarters." Klaxons wailed through the ship. Crewmen ran to battle stations. The deck teams prepared the anti-aircraft guns. There was no fear now, only the mechanical rhythm of men who had rehearsed death too often to resist it. Moments later, the sky filled with dots, dark specks against the blinding blue. The Hiryu's bombers had arrived. They dived out of the sun. Bombs fell like iron raindrops. The first explosion struck the Yorktown's flight deck, tearing open its steel hide. The second detonated near the island tower, sending a column of fire upward like a monstrous tree. The ship lurched, groaning, flames leaping across the deck. Below, sailors fought the blaze with water hoses and sand, coughing through smoke. Some leapt into the sea when the heat grew unbearable, yet the ship refused to die. Hours later, after the fires were beaten down, damage control reported, engines operational. The Yorktown lived, battered but defiant. Fletcher smiled faintly. "She's a tough lady," he murmured. But the Hiryu had one last breath left to give. A second wave arrived late in the afternoon. 4 torpedo bombers, their pilots flying into hell. The Yorktown's gunners opened up, filling the air with steel. One torpedo plane disintegrated in mid-air, another spun into the sea. 2 survived long enough to release their payloads. The torpedoes struck the Yorktown amidships. The ship shuddered as though the ocean itself had punched her. Her engines died. Power flickered and went out. The flames, rekindled, rose higher than before. By evening, the order was given to abandon ship. Sailors slid down ropes into the warm, oil-streaked water, turning to watch their vessel. The proud survivor of Coral Sea list slowly, silently. Spruance received the report aboard the Enterprise and bowed his head. 1 for 4, he said quietly. A hard trade, but a just one. As dusk fell, the sea glowed with a strange orange hue. The reflection of burning ships spread across 100 miles. High above, the last American strike group, guided by fading sunlight, found the Hiryu. The carrier was still launching fighters when the first bombs fell. One struck her amidships, then another, then a third. Fire swallowed her decks in seconds. The heat warped her steel like wax. Admiral Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship. He gathered his officers on the bridge, bowed deeply, and said, "Gentlemen, it is an honor." The Hiryu burned long into the night. When she finally sank, she took with her the last illusion of Japanese invincibility. By dawn, the battle was over. The Pacific lay quiet again, calm, endless, deceitfully peaceful. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and on the waves drifted thousands of fragments, lifeboats, fuel drums, photographs, letters sealed in waterproof bags that would never be opened. The sun rose over a sea of ghosts. From the Enterprise, Spruance looked through his binoculars at the empty horizon. The war was far from over, but something immense had shifted. The tide, once flowing east with the Empire, now turned west, carrying with it the weight of retribution. Below decks, sailors cleaned the flight deck, refueled aircraft, and tended to the wounded. No victory music played, only the low murmur of wind and the steady rhythm of waves against steel. Spruance finally spoke. "We will not celebrate," he said. "We will rebuild." Far away, on the Japanese cruiser Nagura, Admiral Nagumo wrote his final report. His handwriting was neat, almost serene. "Enemy carriers destroyed our striking force. 4 carriers lost. Situation untenable." He paused, the brush hovering over the paper. Then he added one more line, one that no history book would print, but which the ocean itself might remember. "I have seen the sun set on the old world. The Battle of Midway was done. 4 carriers lay beneath the sea. 3,000 men lost, an empire's momentum broken. The Pacific, once Japan's ocean, now belonged to no one, only to time." The wind whispered through the smoke, carrying a single truth. Even victory is only a kind of survival. Night settled slowly over the Pacific. The fires on the horizon dimmed one by one, until only the faint red glow of dying ships remained. The ocean, which had screamed and burned only hours before, now exhaled a long, weary breath. It was over. On the destroyer Nagura, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo sat alone in his cabin, the lamplight swaying with the motion of the sea. The reports lay before him, casualty lists, loss tallies, damage summaries, but his eyes no longer read them. He listened instead to the sound of water against the hull, rhythmic, unfeeling, like time erasing everything it touched. He thought of the men who had died still shouting banzai as their ships went under, of Tomonaga bowing before his final flight, of the Akagi burning like a pyre in the sunset. He had served the emperor all his life, believing in the certainty of hierarchy, in obedience as virtue. Yet tonight, for the first time, he felt the weight of a question that duty could not silence. Had faith become blindness? Outside, the sea was black and calm, an infinite mirror. He whispered to it, as if to an old friend, "The gods do not side with the complacent." Then he extinguished the lamp. The darkness felt merciful. Far across the same ocean, on the Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood at the bridge railing, watching the stars emerge. The air smelled of burnt oil and salt. The deck beneath his boots still carried the heat of battle. Around him, the ship was quiet, engines idling, crews sleeping at their posts. Spruance's face was unreadable, but his mind moved through the day's events with mechanical precision. The intelligence advantage, the timing of the attack, the cost. He had done what needed to be done, no more, no less. Yet he felt no triumph. Only exhaustion and a clarity that frightened him. He thought of the men who had not returned, the dive bombers lost in clouds, the torpedo pilots who never saw the carriers they died for. He thought too of the enemy, professional, brave, doomed by obedience to a plan that could not bend. And he understood that victory, like defeat, leaves the same hollow afterward. The young communications officer approached, hesitating. "Sir, Washington requests your situation report." Spruance nodded, eyes still on the sea. "Tell them the enemy carriers are sunk," he said softly. "Our losses are acceptable, situation stable." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "In war, victory is never an ending. It is a moment to breathe before the next storm." The officer saluted and left. Spruance remained alone with the wind. Between these two men, one surrendering the old world, one defining the new, the Pacific lay vast and eternal. Their fleets had crossed it with fire and steel, but in the end, both were only guests upon its surface. The omniscient voice returned, distant, almost tender. "War teaches the same lesson to every generation, that courage is equal on both sides, but wisdom is what endures." The night deepened. The stars drifted over the wrecks below, glittering like the souls of the fallen. And the sea, as always, kept their secrets. Dawn returned to the Pacific as if nothing had happened. The same wind blew, the same horizon glowed faintly pink. But beneath the calm surface, the sea held a new silence. Heavy, endless, filled with the ghosts of men who had vanished into its depths. Oil slicks drifted like dark mirrors upon the water, reflecting a sky too pure for what had passed below it. A shattered wing bobbed in the surf. A life jacket turned slowly in the tide. The ocean had reclaimed its dominion. Above, gulls circled in lazy arcs. Their cries were thin, echoing over the emptiness where once entire empires had shouted their pride. No ships remained. Only traces, a floating shoe, a twisted frame, the faint smell of smoke dissolving into salt air. In the great, slow rhythm of the sea, even ruin becomes rhythm. From somewhere unseen, the omniscient voice rose again, quieter now, stripped of all command and calculation. Men built fleets as if they could own the ocean. They named the waves after gods, the winds after glory. Yet the sea has no memory for names, only for echoes. In time, the coral reefs would claim the hulls. The fish would pass through the rusted ribs of carriers that once bore nations' dreams. The maps would be redrawn. The world would move on. But the water would remember. It would remember the roar of engines, the thunder of bombs, the final cries swallowed by depth, and it would hold them in perfect wordless peace. As the sun climbed higher, light spread across the Pacific, turning the oil-slicked waves into molten gold. A seabird crossed that light, wings stretched wide, vanishing into the horizon. It seemed, for a moment, to carry with it every unspoken story, every unfinished letter, every name that history would forget. And then the world was quiet, completely. "Victory never belongs to the strongest," the narrator whispered, "but to those who understand their own fragility." The sea answered with silence, and in that silence the age of empires ended.